Anybody who studies that, left-winger, right-winger, except for a few on the right, understand this. You can take a look at the Gini coefficient. You can take a look at all this status from the IRS and all the rest. We have moved wealth from the bottom and the middle in this country to the top. That's why even our candidates talk about the middle class is dying, the middle class is going. Yeah, that's right. The middle has fallen out, number one. Number two, you subjected them after this kind of a thing to a pandemic, which really shook them up, an inflation, which shook them up, still shakes them up, and a serious diminution in your position in the world. You have, over the last 30 to 40 years, you lost the war in Vietnam, you lost the war in Afghanistan, you lost the war in Iraq, and you are losing the war in Ukraine. Too many things are happening. And the working class is hit in too many ways. It's upset, it's angry, it doesn't see a way out. That's a description of the German working class. That's why it went with Hitler. Enough, not all of it by a long shot, but enough of it to give him the chance to get rid of all of his enemies and reshape Germany. That ought to strike a chord. This morning's headline, the headline when I opened my news, was that President Trump has appointed Vice President Vance to remove from the Smithsonian Institute the anti-American improper ideology. What the hell is that? What is that? You know what the first thing comes to my mind? In the 1950s here in America, we had something called the Un-American Activities Committee in the House of Representatives that hounded people out of their jobs and their positions because they held views that a collection of congressmen, many from the South, held to be un-American. Now, we've come to regret that. That's McCarthyism, and but that's what they did. By the way, among the people who left the United States because they were hounded by this committee for their ideas were Bertolt Brecht, Charlie Chaplin. I could go on. That's one of the reasons we came, I thought, to understand what an aberrant, horrible period this was. We understood nothing. We're just doing it again. Will the outcome be the same? I don't know. Maybe they'll win this time. Maybe we won't have what happened in the 50s. We'll have what happened in Germany in the 30s. But the story in Germany of a working class that was shocked. The American working class was told that America was the king of the hill, which coming out of World War II, we were. And that this was just, it was the way it was, American exceptionalism, the uniqueness. God loves us, whatever the form in which you celebrated it. But nobody here was prepared that it would come to an end. That for the first time in a century, we actually have an economic competitor called China. We never had that. Russia, I think I told you this before, Russia was never, Soviet Union was not an economic competitor. It was way too poor, way too small. Even today, the American GDP is $28-29 trillion. Russian GDP, $3 trillion. This is David and Goliath. But David minus the slingshot. You know, what? They have military, they have nuclear weapons. I shouldn't say minus the slingshot. Here's a slingshot. But it's still David with a slingshot. China's 18 or 19 trillion. That's a serious competitor. The two together, now you're talking. And they understand it. And so do the folks here, but not the American people. They must be kept innocent of all of this, except when they leak their materials to the Atlantic magazine.
One particular possible symptom I'd be curious to hear about.
That capitalism needs to go through all the phases it can to survive. It adjusted the private quality of its beginnings by allowing the state to take a bigger and bigger role. It didn't do it in a straight line. The great crash of 1929 brought the government in massively to save capitalism. But in the aftermath of World War II, they pushed the government back out. That's what you and I have lived our lives in a period when they pushed the government out. In a way, Mr. Trump is the end of that period. When we pushed he'd bring the government back in. But here's the crucial thing for China. We've had the government minimal, early capitalism. We've had the government brought in, Keynes, the Depression, and then this thing called Scandinavian socialism, which seemed to mean a regulatory government, a taxing government, lots of social services produced by the government, but basically private capitalism for the bulk of the goods and services in the society. So that's another form. Then we had the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union called itself socialist, like the Scandinavians do, but they meant something very different. They meant the government takes over and runs the enterprise. And they said that was socialism. But I would argue, as you've heard me, I think, before, that it isn't. It wasn't socialism. I don't dispute. You can call it whatever you want. But they never changed the employer-employee structure of enterprises. Small group of people, the owner, the director, the board of directors, whatever you want to call it, overseeing and ordering about a mass of workers who are employees. They have very little power. They have all the power. These people fire those, not the other way around. These people direct those, not the other way around. These people produce a surplus that they get, not the other way around. In other words, this is a highly structured arrangement. For me, that's capitalism. And that was there when capitalism was small and had a few workers, and it's there with a major corporation today. It's there whether the private people do it or whether the government does it. So for me, we're still working out all the ways you can have capitalism if you understand it as the employer-employee relationship in production. Then China is simply the latest experiment in yet another form. It's not private capitalism, where you might take the example Britain and the United States. It's not the Soviet Union, no private capitalism, all government does everything. The in-between, Scandinavian, with a little government and mostly private. And now the Chinese, 50-50, with a super powerful state and Communist Party on top. That's a wrinkle. But that wrinkle has been more productive in a shorter amount of time than any of the others. Just like the absolute monarchies were the most effective, spectacular achievements of feudalism. So I'm not surprised. I think the reason China is ahead is it figured out that form of capitalism which could get it out of poverty, which was its number one goal. 100 years of humiliation of China, was it because it was poor, backward technologically, underdeveloped, like the whole global South, like all of Africa, like most of Asia, like most of Latin America. The name of the game for them was, above all else, not the struggle of capitalism and socialism. The leaders were worried about that. For the mass of people, how to get out of my poverty, all that meant, and begin to live life. The Chinese Communist Party understood that, in part because of their differences with the Soviet Union stuff that we talked about. And they understood that's the way we're going to try to do it. With all the risks, all the possibilities of failure, we're going to do a hybrid of 50. We're going to let the private go under our control. Meanwhile, keep our control by having half the economy right under our That's how we're going to do it. And at this moment, the year 2025, there is no contest anymore. Look at it this way. Europe had 500 years to get ready to compete with the United States. They failed. All the hot technology in the world today comes from the United States or China. Europe, nothing. Nothing. Look, there's no comparable Apple or Microsoft or BYD. BYD, the electric Chinese, they're on the roads of Europe because they don't have a 100% tariff. We do. So
100%.
100%. Mr. Trump put it up to 27.5%, and Mr. Biden raised it to 100%. So if you want to buy a BYD electric car, best in the world, cheapest in the world, $30,000, get a car. But that's what it'll cost. They'll ship you a car from China. They ship all over the world. I mean, all of that's taken care of. They're a very, very big and powerful company. By the way, there's an American who has a big piece of it, owns a big piece of BYD. His name is Warren Buffett.
Smart, canny guy.
Yeah. Not held back by stupid leftover Cold War nonsense. Never was. Anyway, BYD can't bring a car here because the $30,000 car, which I would buy tomorrow if I could, I have to give 100% tax to Uncle Sam. Another 30. So for me, the car costs $60,000, not 30. And that's why I don't buy any, because I can buy a $40,000 or $50,000 electric car from GM or Ford or Tesla or somebody else. It's not as good, but I don't have it. There's no tariff. Anyway, these situations mean that Mr. Musk and the United States are more and more looked at as a problem to contain, a little bit like Soviet communism looked to Americans. And the Chinese, in my judgment, are on the cusp, as we are in the United States, although for completely different reasons, given our very different situations. We're on the cusp of discovering what European feudalism discovered, that the highest achievement, capitalism in China as this hybrid, is also the last achievement. Now the Louis in France, who built Versailles, were the same family of Louis who ended up on the guillotine with their heads chopped off. I'm, of course, not suggesting anything remotely like that could or would ever happen here. Pause for effect. But the point is, now comes the question, what do we need to do better than what the Chinese have done? What's the next stage? How will people define the problems that the Chinese have and will have? Even the Chinese, they're very wise about that. They understand their system has problems, different from what they used to have. Thank God, they're much better off than they used to be, but they have all kinds of economic and other problems. Here's my prediction. These problems will, sooner or later, and I hope it's sooner, be addressed by daring to relearn Marx's lesson. Take a look at how you organize production. The notion that you have to have a few people at the top who run the show and a mass of people underneath who do the work is your problem. You've got to get rid of that. It's a little bit like understanding that for the centuries that there was slavery, there were all kinds of people who understood those slave systems had a problem. And there were all kinds of people who understood, let's solve the problem this way. Give the slave a better diet. Give the slave some more clothing. Put the slave in a decent house. Stop beating the slave. Don't sell the wife against the husband. Blah, blah, blah. And then there were people who said, no, you ain't going to solve your problem that way. You know what your problem is? The master-slave relationship. That's got to go. That's me. I'm just doing that now. It's that relationship that has to go. It's done. That was Marx's point. Poor fellow. Back in the 19th century, 150 years ago, he tried to get that across. Marx made mistakes. Marx is no saint and none of that. But he was very smart. And he set himself the problem, how do you do better than capitalism? And he spent a lifetime trying to figure it out. And he ended up with this conclusion, in my judgment. And I'm open to interpretations. Very Hegelian. The problem of capitalism is itself. It's not this or that. It's not get the workers a bigger wage. Stop. It's like getting the slave a better diet. Stop! Of course, we are in favor of a better diet for the slave. We're decent people. But that's not the problem. The problem is slavery, and the problem is capitalism. The problem, you have a tiny group of people who make all the decisions. Guess what? They're going to take the money and be the wealthy people, the top 10%, aren't they? Everywhere, all the time. And every few years we'll have a war on the poverty, which we seem unable to overcome. Now, why might that be? Look at the taboo in our culture right up to this minute. You can look at almost anything, but not that economic system. We will criticize our education system. We will criticize our transportation system. We even criticize institutions like marriage, like heterosexuality. But criticize the employer-employee doesn't occur to anyone. Well, 20 years ago, it didn't occur to anyone to question sexism, or in many parts of the country, racism. There comes a time when in history it becomes possible to say, hey, this is outrageous, we won't tolerate this. That's going to come for capitalism. And my guess is it's a crapshoot. Whether it comes in the dying capitalism of the West or the rising capitalism of the East. My guess it's going to happen in both of them. And wherever it happens first, it'll be infectious on the other. Because the idea will be the problems we face now are finally those which will allow us to ask the question, might the solution to these problems be changing the organization of the workplace from a hierarchical top-down to, dare I say, a democratic arrangement in which all the people at the workplace get together, talk it out, and then have a vote. One person, one vote. After we've looked at all the technical and other aspects, after we've asked the opinions of those who have the technical information we need to make an informed decision. I remind people, all the key decisions in major corporations are made by a board of directors, most of whom have no technical expertise whatsoever. They bring in the specialists who explain to them, as is needed to make the decision, what the technical ramifications. When I explain how a democratic workplace is to be there, the sweeper can make a decision like the heart surgeon in a hospital. Sure he can. Those decisions that are technically complicated, the heart surgeons have to explain what they know. And the sweeper tells them about keeping the hallways clean. And then when everybody's had a chance to explain, then you make a decision. That's all any board of directors ever did. That's what the workers democratically will do. And don't tell me it's not workable, because the same argument was used. How can uninformed voters make a decision? We need a king. We cut the king's head off. And the decisions are not arguably any worse, and in many ways better. So let's do that. Let's finally bring democracy to the workplace. It's long overdue. That's the next stage. That's what the revolution is about. Whether we'll see it this year, next year, who knows? But nobody should say of folks like us that we only have a criticism. No, we do have a criticism. Nowadays, it's less and less necessary to justify having a criticism, since everybody is feeling the need that there be some criticism because of what's going on. But we are often charged with not having an alternative. Yes, we do. And a good one, and one that comes right out of the problems today. I don't think we solve the poverty problem without the kind of change I've talked about. And my proof, look at it. We're surrounded by poverty. We've had wars on poverty repeatedly, every 20 years. This problem doesn't go away. In Volume 1 of Capital, Marx writes that the capitalist system has to be understood as being as successful in reproducing poverty as it is in reproducing wealth. That's right. And boy, is that a Hegelian moment. The dollar is down against the euro by 10% from the day that Mr. Trump became president to now. Now, what in the world is going on? That's not to be at 10% in a 3-month period. That's as dramatic in foreign exchange as what Michael told us about the stock market changing 4% in 2 days. These are crazy movements, and you don't know who the United States government is going to decide to sanction. Remember that tariffs is one way of whacking the world. Sanctions is another way. And there are half a dozen countries or more that are now sanctioned. The United States is the #1 sanctioning power. No other country comes close. So the United States is giving reasons by these actions and by the up and down, herky-jerky rise and fall to boot of these actions. So you'll make the dollar less and less. Why would you use it? Its value is uncertain. Its vulnerability for you is uncertain. You don't want to do that. It's much better to trade with and to deal with less insecure elements of your exchange relationships. And so the dollar is less desirable, but it's not just the dollar. They're looking for export markets outside the United States because the one here is too risky. They're looking for imports from other parts of the world because those from the United States are too risky. You know, people think there's no cost to invoking national security, something Michael mentioned a few moments ago. But that's a very dangerous game to play. If you use that very loosely, then nobody knows when it will be used against them. You know, the libertarian ideology, which is experiencing, for me anyway, a very welcome death these days. The notion that the world is run by good and bad governments, and everything bad is because the government intervenes, and everything good is when you privatize. We are watching the United States take a hatchet to that idea. Look at the government intervention, you know, this way, that way, one way, this way in the morning and that way in the afternoon. This is now a governmental interventionist economic system. And the ideology of libertarianism is flipped out the window. It was never more than a gloss on the free trade idea which the United States could benefit from when it was the only game in town after World War II. Now that it's not the only game in town, free trade is out the window, neoliberalism is out the window, and the libertarian ideology that piggybacked off of it, it's out the window too. The weapon of the United States is the fact that it's a wealthy market and that the president is letting the Japanese, for example, and many others, let them know that we are prepared now to weaponize that. Whatever lip service we give to libertarianism, that's all it is. It's lip service. We will use it when it's a convenient rationale, as when you fire public employees. You make a nonsense argument that this is an exercise in efficiency, or you make an even more nonsense argument that this privatization will somehow improve the situation out of a notion that the private is somehow always better because profit drives you to behave better than any other motivation might. These are dying arguments. They don't apply anymore. Most of what's going on now is active government intervention, which directly violates the notions of privatization, efficiency, and all of the rest of it. So you're watching a naked use of the wealth of the United States. The Japanese need to sell cars in the United States. They already produce many of them here because at earlier times, I don't know if people know this, but back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the United States imposed quotas on the Japanese. The way it worked was no tariff, but you couldn't bring more than X 100,000 Japanese vehicles to the United States in a calendar year. That's another way of protecting GM, Ford, and at that time Chrysler. Well, now it's being done by the tariff threat. Already the Japanese produce many of their cars here inside the United States. I'm sure that that's part of the goal of doing that. But as Michael just alluded to, American wages being what they are, and the cost of business in this country being what it is, especially because so much of those costs is not socialized, not done cheaply by the government, but rather expensively by the private profit makers who run it, your cars are going to have to cost a great deal more money. And that opens up the whole danger of an inflation coming out of all of this, which is simply put behind some sort of curtain. So we're supposed to discuss it as if this were not the case. And the rest of the world looks at all of this and, sees it as crazy, but has to take care of its own business first, which is not to take the blow of being told that your American market is no longer going to generate the profits that you're used to, that you've been used to for 20 years. This is all being taken away from you. That's Mr. Trump's objective. His real goal, he dare not say it, but his real goal is that producers in other countries, Japan and any other country, will be so horrified by the loss of sales in the United States, now that Americans will have to pay Uncle Sam a tariff on top of the price of the item, that they're going to lower the prices of what they sell as a way to make the net effect of a tariff less than if it was just added to their unchanged price. In other words, they're going to absorb the pain of compensating for the American tariff. And that makes them angry because it's clear that this is advantaging the United States at their expense, straight out. And, they're going to yell about the private capitalists in Japan are going to the Japanese government and saying, hey, you're our government. We pay you taxes. Do something. Make this problem go away. We can't, we're making an 8% profit. With a 10% tariff, we're done. We're not going to make any profit at all. And if that happens, we're going to lay off 50,000 workers. And if that happens, you're going to lose the next election. I mean, this is not a polite conversation. And Mr. Trump imagines that he's in a position to impose this much pain on so many countries who will therefore just lie down, roll over, and do what they're told. We're not there anymore. It's too late for that. And the denial of that is in the end holding back the policy recognition. If we had a real opposition in this country, an opposition party, they would be going to town with all of this. Instead, we have a Democratic Party which is brain dead, which has nothing to say, which is waiting for Mr. Trump to implode, which, by the way, may work. He may do so much damage and bring down so much trouble that an exhausted country will vote for the Democrats, not because they're better, but because this has proven itself to be awful.